First, thank you so much for inviting me, and also thank you so much to Mario, because I could not have done a better kind of in terms of framing and giving some kind of transition to what I'm going to talk about. It's just incredible. I was just saying our work has such an incredible overlap and fit, and I just couldn't have done a better job. I'm so glad you went first, because it really it's real. There's so much overlap here, which is really great. Yeah, thank you again so much for having me out here. It was a really great excuse to actually come out and spend this week doing field work out in California. So when I met Ava over the summer at the Ag and Human Values Conference, and she said, maybe you could Skype in, and I was like, maybe my dean will send me and I can get a lot of work done. So this has been an incredibly fruitful week. And as you'll see, I'm in the middle of actually thinking through a lot of my California work right now, literally in the middle of a week of field work. So I'm going to talk today about also work that I'm doing for a book project on what I call the New American Farmer. This particular talk around agrarian questions, race, and immigration. So as kind of my introduction stated, I'm really fascinated by the case of Latino immigrant farmers. And as Mario started alluding to, the conditions that we have currently and have had for a very long time, where Latino immigrants are doing the majority of the field work in California and the rest of the country, and not necessarily owning land or owning their own businesses, but doing the majority of the labor. When I was doing my dissertation work, which started in California, I was really interested in looking at labor and looking at the conditions that farm workers were experiencing in terms of food insecurity. And what really fascinated me is that majority of farm workers that we have in the United States and California and beyond are people that are coming from agrarian backgrounds, people that are really campesinos themselves, that have so much knowledge around food and agriculture and growing food, but then come here dispossessed from their land through international trade agreements and other types of political violence, and end up, people with so much agrarian knowledge are ending up food insecure in the fields, working in these factories in the fields. And so I was curious, how are they coping with that? And again, as Mario was talking about, kind of what is there resistance here? And in my dissertation, I started to see kind of this very small movement of farm workers that were trying to get access to land for both gardening and farming. And that was just a little kernel of the work that I started doing about 7 years ago. And as I started doing the dissertation and I started asking questions about whether people were accessing land and whether that was possible, I realized that it was a whole nother project that I was really excited to eventually dive into for my postdoc work. What kind of the USDA agrarian census, although I think it's pretty flawed, but even within the USDA agrarian census, we see that in terms of numbers that this is happening, right? That there's been a 25% increase over the 5-year period from 2007 to 2012. And when the USDA just kind of does these really broad racial categories and they say Latino, obviously that's not all immigrant. And I will break down kind of what I'm talking about in my own work, because obviously the category of Latino is very complex. Right, but this is happening, and in my work I said I really wanted to look at a national scale at how this is happening and what the challenges are and what the opportunities are, both for resistance and kind of if it can mean something for these farmers themselves, if it can mean something for this broader kind of food movement that I think we should be very critical about. So this is just a overall framework. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research questions and what I'm starting to see and argue. So my research broadly looks at under what conditions are immigrant farm workers transitioning to farm operating and ownership in the United States at large. And what do these transitions mean for kind of traditional agrarian questions? And I'll talk more about what I mean by that in terms of transitions in land and labor. And so, yeah. Tell you what I'm starting to find, what I'm starting to argue. So what I'm finding is that farm workers, particularly, so like I said, starting to kind of get a little more specific, and farm workers who for the most part are Latino in the United States and are still first-generation immigrants working in the field. are starting to succeed in accessing farms and accessing land, and definitely, again, as Mario pointed out, not in making great strides in terms of land ownership, right? We're not breaking down these big corporate farms, but they are starting to break in a way that I think a lot of people are not expecting to see. And I'm starting to find this all across the country, is these pockets of farm workers that are succeeding in accessing land and starting their own farms. And what is really interesting to me, and especially in terms of the bigger movement around food and sustainability and local food and questions of those types of questions around food, is that although it might make kind of rational sense for them to work their way up the ladder, become industrial monocrop farmers, as we see in these big kind of corporate sense, right? And this would be what Marx argues in terms of class transition. That's not actually what they're doing, right? What we're seeing is a very different form of farming that I'll talk about, and one that might be called a more sustainable form of farming, right? And so many farmers actually prefer more small-scale, diverse cropping systems, as I said, right? A lot of them are coming from agrarian backgrounds themselves. For the most part, they are, especially there's a larger and larger population of Oaxacan immigrants in California today that are coming from very rural, very subsistence backgrounds in farming. Right, and for them, I argue that there is, as Ava was talking about, there is this very cultural and a strong relationship between their identity and agrarian livelihood, right? So it's not just about a business for them, it is about this much more kind of Jeffersonian ideal that we think of that, as we know, is not actually what we have in this country, right? They're actually attached to the land in a very different way. And when they're interested in owning their own land and having their own farming business, they don't want to replicate the type of farms that they've been working on. Right, in addition to kind of what the more romantic version of, what they want, there's also, their form of farming is also a result of racial exclusions, right? And just explicit and more systemic or institutional forms of racial discrimination that actually keep them very limited in terms of scale, right? Again, they're not becoming these big corporate farmers, sometimes because that's not what they want, and sometimes because they don't have that option. So a little bit around my framework. As I said, the agrarian question is kind of from Marxist literature looking at agrarian transitions in land. Right, where, and I won't go too much into this, but Marx is looking at class transition and predicts that dispossessed farmers will eventually become industrial laborers. Then we have Kautsky, who comes in and starts asking, well, why does that not happen, right? Why in agriculture are things kind of different in terms of transitions? And he starts to argue that there's this kind of backwards way of thinking in agriculture that kind of gets in the way of classic industrial transitions. And that has been brought up again and again today, where people would argue, well, it's done, right? It's industrial. Now farming's industrial. We have factories in the fields. Why are we even talking about this anymore? And there's a whole kind of body of literature within critical agrarian studies that's constantly still having these debates, particularly today in the context of food justice and more global food sovereignty movements. And we see these peasant movements all over the world. That are becoming more and more visible. And people are saying, well, people still are resisting this transition to industrial corporate farming, right? Although in some places like California, we could say it's over and done with, there are many places in the world where it still hasn't fully happened. Or like what I'm starting to see is people that maybe have become the workers, but still are saying that's not what I want for myself. And when I have the chance to farm, I'm going to farm in a different way. So again, I'm also really interested in kind of like how are people resisting these structures, and is it a real viable option for a different way of a food system, really? I'm also really, my work is influenced, right, by this very strong political economy perspective and debates around political economy of agriculture, as well as discussions that happen more around food identity and food ways. And so people like Psyche Williams-Forson and Jessica Harris look at the importance of food to agrarian livelihoods and maintaining kind of culture and racial identity. Right now I'm teaching a class called Food Identity and Power, and where my students I really wanted to teach a class where people didn't just think about Food Inc. and the industrialization of food, but where people recognize, right, that although, yes, things are very corporate, not only is there just this big white foodie movement that was happening through Chez Panisse and in the Bay Area, but communities all over the world have been resisting corporate agriculture and maintaining foodways forever, right? It's not just this new thing, the food movement. right? Michael Pollan didn't just like discover and invent the food movement in the New York Times, but people have been doing this, right? Chinese restaurants have been there resisting, the racial, the Exclusion Act, right? It's been happening all over the place. And it continues to happen, right? As big and bad as corporate agriculture is, there's communities still maintain a sense of identity around food and agriculture, right? And it relates to the ways that communities resist, and I think maintain relationships and a sense of who they are, right? And so I'm really interested in kind of how these things intersect. So like I said, this is, at this point, I'm really doing a national study. So after I finished my dissertation work in California, my postdoc took me back east to Maryland, where I started to make some connections in Virginia, and found that there was a whole community of farm workers from Jalisco that had pretty much dominate the fruit and vegetable growing in the northern neck region of Virginia. So that's right. So right down here, about an hour and a half south of Washington, D.C. They are 80% of the fruit and vegetable growers in that area. They don't speak any English, right? It's a completely Spanish-speaking community. I started to find them through the farmers markets there, became really interested in that particular case study. Now that I live up in New York, I was like, well, where are they here? In the Hudson Valley, there's a smaller group of Mexican immigrants there. That have started, again, what I'm starting to see here, it is small-scale fruit and vegetable, low-input style farming. And this week, I'm actually back in California getting to follow up with some of the stuff I started to see in California when I was here. And I'll talk about in a minute the ways that California, in some ways, overlaps what's happening on the East Coast, and in some ways is very different because of this very intense industrial history here that is very, it's just much more industrial here than the East Coast ever has been in terms of agriculture. Right, and so I started doing, so really my work is in the Salinas Valley, in the Hollister and Salinas areas. And so some of you, has anyone ever heard of ALBA, the Agricultural Land-Based Training Association? Ryan has. So it's an organization that's been around since, I think, the 70s. And the idea was actually to do exactly that. I forget what now you're making me want to go back and learn all like the history that I learned when I first learned about them. But there was a relationship there between them and the UFW, but they wanted to do exactly what, wasn't being done, which is why don't we have these farm workers access land? So it became a training program for farm workers to start accessing land. And essentially, right, you don't just have to access land, but you need to learn business skills. You need to learn a lot of other, farming in very rural parts of Mexico is very different than farming in California. So they essentially, a lot of it was the business part that ALBA trains them to do and is still training people to do. So it's a really incredible education program, and they have an incubator farm that's kind of a hotbed for training recent immigrants who are farm workers into entering agriculture as owners in California. There's all types of different controversies, and it's flawed. No nonprofit, no program is perfect. But it has created a whole community in the Salinas Valley of basically farm workers that are small-scale farmers, and some succeed and some don't. But that's pretty much why I ended up in the Salinas Valley doing a study there. So what I've been finding, right, is like I said, what I was interested in is people that were already farmers, right? They come here with the knowledge of growing. They become farm workers, right? They're dispossessed. They become laborers. And then this pattern of then reclaiming the land, going back to the land as owners, right? And it's not economically rational, right? To enter into agriculture today is not easy, right? It's not, and these are people with very little, economic capital to go into this business. But what I'm seeing is, time and time again, they just tell me how hard it is, and I ask them, well, why are you doing this? Why didn't you go into another industry? Why aren't you trying to own a restaurant or construction once you've saved up this money, which is incredibly challenging for them to do with how little they make. And what I hear time and time again is this kind of connection to who they are through food, through growing. They want their kids to grow up on a farm, right? They want their kids to understand what that relationship is. particularly, like I said, here in California, where we have a growing population of Oaxacan immigrants and immigrants from Michoacan who speak indigenous languages. That community is kind of, they're very isolated from a lot of the other farm workers, both by language and by culture, and also because they're discriminated against by a lot of the workers that have been here longer. And so for them, to be able to recreate the type of community and culture that they had in Oaxaca has been really powerful, whether it's a garden or a small farm. But for them, I hear time and time again, it's a reminder for them of home. And so what I see in all three places, right, is that there's really a replication of what people talk about in the food movement, right? They talk about the importance of small scale, low input, right? So interestingly, in California, most of these farmers are certified organic because of the ALBA program. And I think organic gets such an additional value added, whereas on the East Coast, it's not exactly appreciated in the same way, and the markets are just very different. It's kind of a whole nother conversation. But even on the East Coast, they're low input, right? They tell me, like, we're not certified, we can't afford it, and quite honestly, the paperwork is just so difficult to do if you don't have an institution helping you with and you don't speak any English. But they're very much low input, low spray. On the East Coast, they're doing direct markets, like farmers markets. Again, California is different because those markets are so saturated. So they're ending up selling to wholesalers, even though they are doing this very kind of localized, multi-cropped type of farming, right? Again, this is the type of farming that I think is held up and idealized by the food movement, even though that's a complicated term. But yet, these aren't the types of farmers that you see when you go to Whole Foods, right? You don't see them. They're not the pictures that are up there. Like, forget the fact that the farm workers aren't up there. But what you see is, a very kind of white picture of a farmer. And they're not, even though they are getting into some of the markets, they're not part of the same kind of networks that a lot of other white farmers are able to access. So part of my project is, I want to see them included in this movement. I want to see them recognized for the incredible work they're doing. The labor question is a really interesting one, because we'd all like to think, oh, well, small-scale farmers treat workers better. That's not always true, necessarily. What I'm seeing is, for the most part, these farms are at a pretty small scale, and they're mostly functioning on family labor. But when it comes down to it, they have even less money to pay their workers than a lot of other farmers. So it's really hard for them financially, right, to provide any better wages or benefits to the workers if they are hiring outside their family. So unfortunately, in terms of labor, it's not necessarily going to change the picture, right? There's all these reasons why it's hard for them to pay the laborers. They always tell me, I worked in the fields, I'm going to treat them more humanely, it's more just, right? So, and I do generally believe that, right? That they believe that, they're out there in the fields essentially still working as a worker. And I think that also affects their practices in terms of not wanting to put chemicals in the fields because they are working alongside with the workers. But in terms of the big picture of changing labor, right? Small scale farmers aren't necessarily treating their workers better, whether they're farm workers themselves or whether they're white farmers. And there's plenty of studies that are showing us that even organic farmers aren't also treating their workers any better. So we can't make any assumptions about labor. It's a complicated part of it. This past week, I've been kind of thrown for a loop, though. So I started seeing what I'm showing you guys, and I've started to be able to tell this story about my research that, immigrants that are starting to start their own farms are doing these more sustainable practices, right? That this kind of idealized type of farming, right? I'm almost getting into like a romantic way of talking about it, right? Then I come back to California, where things are a lot less romantic in the fields, right? And so interestingly, and this is actually all information from the California Strawberry Commission, who is not historically very labor friendly. They really want everyone to know right now. They have a whole campaign to let us know that 2/3 of strawberry farmers are technically identified as Latino, right? And they actually have put together all these documents, a white paper. They've done some kind of op-eds in newspapers talking about how amazing strawberries are because immigrants can get into this at low cost, right? Because you don't need as big of a plot of land to start with strawberries. And I think they are really on a a communications campaign to kind of get a better name for themselves because they haven't had good press recently around kind of fights around chemicals. And they really want people, so this is fascinating. All of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, the Strawberry Commission's like talking about what I'm talking about, right? Right, but then it's important to kind of break down, who are they talking about here and who am I talking about here and what are these differences? Right, so first when they're talking about Latinos, they like to tell a story of immigration, but essentially I don't think most of the strawberry farmers are first-generation immigrants, although they might come from Latino families. They certainly aren't representative of the people that are working in the fields right now, so they're mostly from northern Mexico, much lighter complexion. And these are people that have had the ability to work their way up through as foremen, as farm managers, and now are able to save enough money to kind of get into strawberry farming. So yes, strawberry farming is easier for an immigrant to get into. It's not necessarily changing anything about the game. I think it just kind of gives it's a better image for the Strawberry Commission. But it is part of this story, right? Because then I'm starting to see now that I've been out in the fields the past couple of days, right, is that, well, what would necessarily keep a small-scale immigrant farmer, right, maintaining all these sustainable practices? Is there pressure for them to just get into strawberries because they can make more money and it's a lot easier, right? And is that eventually what's going to happen to them too, right? Or is all of this kind of stuff around sustainability just kind of unsustainable? Right, and I think there's a big question around that for me still in my research, and that's what I'm looking at now. Will the types of farmers that I'm looking at and talking to, will they kind of maintain these ideal practices, or will the market kind of squeeze them also into monocropping? And I think the possibility is yes, right? Is there something else that's going to keep them doing these other forms of farming? I think somewhat yes, right? So I think it's, like I said, California is really kind of an interesting case study in this because it really is so industrial. So I think there's kind of, what I'm finding here is there's much more of a complex racial hierarchy among farm workers themselves. And in terms of immigrants working in agriculture, I think there's also many different kind of levels of what's going on. But I think it's, while it's important to look at who are the strawberry farmers, right, I do think that these farmers are also resisting and persisting. And although they may not be right now kind of reclaiming all that land, right, they are still part of what's going on in agriculture today. I asked a farmer actually yesterday, so you can tell I'm kind of thinking through this while I'm talking to you guys. I had a much neater presentation before I did field work for 2 days this week. As I said to this one farmer who's one of the more successful farm workers that's transitioned into owning his own farm in the past couple of years. He has 5 acres, he has 4 employees. He's still out there in the fields every day working with them. And he's relatively doing well at what he's doing compared to some other people. And I said, well, what's the difference between you and, the immigrant strawberry farmers or the Latino strawberry farmers? You know those guys, what's the difference here? Is it different? Am I trying to read into this too much? And he said to me something that, really has stuck with me the past couple of days. He said, they do it for the money, I do it for the freedom. Right? And I think that goes back to my original kind of arguments around lifestyle and identity, is for him, he talked to me about his ancestors. He talked to me about kind of reclaiming, what food and agriculture means to him and his family. He has successfully been able to put it, he still rents the land, but he has a house on the land and he's living on this farm, which is not what strawberry farmers do, right? And most of the farmers I talk to, that's what they want. They want, the dream is ultimately to live on the land. They talk to me about, 15 acres will be great. I want to make a living off of it, but I don't want more than that, right? Some of them have even said, I don't want to hire anyone outside my family. That's not what I want. I want a lifestyle. And it might be that this is, too hard in California. It might be that California is not the place they can do it. It might be that the East Coast is an easier place to attain that kind of dream. I want to make sure there's still time for discussion. I haven't gone so much into kind of the limitations for them, right? Even if they want to get into big ag, there's all types of racialized limitations for them, right? And I think race is really essential to discussing their limitations, right? Because you could say, well, anybody needs kind of a lot of money. It's really hard to break into. But particularly when you're a first-generation immigrant, and for those, coming from really rural parts of Mexico that came here, started in farm work young, don't necessarily have beyond a 3rd or 4th grade education, so they can't read and write in Spanish or their own native language, let alone English. Right, farming in the United States, no matter where you are, is very bureaucratic. There's a lot of forms. If you want to get a loan from the USDA, even if you are a citizen, right, you have to fill out so many forms that white farmers oftentimes can't do it. So imagine then if you don't have a level of education and you don't have the language. So I've talked at length, and a big part of my work that I'm not talking about today, right, is actually discrimination just within the USDA. And kind of what's happening when they do go into those offices and try and access resources. Right, so there's all different kinds of levels, I think, that are limiting their ability to actually get into a bigger scale of farming. Right, so like I said, there's kind of these two ends of it. There's kind of the happy reclaiming identity, then there's the, well, and even if they wanted to, they can't because of all these institutional forms of discrimination. This is one farmer in California said to me, the government agencies say, oh, organic farmers, there's resources for them. But if you are illegal, he used the word illegal, and you don't have access to these federal funds, the rules are always changing, but yes, it's quite a process. Every day it's a process to be an organic farmer, right? And he was talking about the limitations. He can't access the same resources that other farmers can. Another woman said to me, if you go to an agency and you're a Latino person and you're a woman and you don't speak the language and you don't have money and you're going to an agency of the federal government and you want to find someone to speak your language, how do you say this? Right, and she's speaking obviously literally, but I think metaphorically too, right? She says they don't want to help you. They don't want to have a person that speaks your language. In California, there are Spanish speakers in the USDA offices. In Virginia and in New York, there are not. They don't even have the forms on the websites in Spanish, although they exist, right? If I call the USDA office, or I've met with, the part of my research is not just meeting with the farmers, but I've met with USDA Extension, all types of nonprofits that are doing this work all over the country, right? And they don't have those forms available. If I call and I say, how do I find a form in Spanish? And and they also admit that, say in Virginia, they know 80% of the farmers are only Spanish speaking, and they still don't have the forms, right? And then they'll say, well, they won't give us a translator because we don't have enough people coming into the office making the requests, right? But people aren't going to come into the office if no one can communicate with them, right? It's obviously a catch-22. Right, so there's all types of things going on at the federal level that's limiting their ability to get into farming. So right now, and this is just again kind of drawing out to the bigger context, they claim, Vilsack has claimed, right, that we're in a new age for civil rights in the USDA. This is off kind of in the context of the history of the Pigford case around African American farmers, the lawsuit claiming kind of the history of discrimination in the USDA against African American farmers. There's also more recently been a case for Hispanic farmers and women farmers. Right, and so the USDA has basically said, yeah, we've been discriminating. In this case, it was, instead of a class action case, it was settled as a claims process, which actually right now it's currently being settled. It's a mess. They've actually rejected something like over 80% of the claims, which they say people didn't fill out the forms right? And that's something I find in my research is it's all about, the forms are kind of the thing that gets people. The Pigford case, people were much more successful in claiming the funds. But this case has absolutely been a mess. I've been talking to people in the federal government too that have been managing the case. Right, so this is all to say, right, this is documented structural discrimination against these farmers, right? Everything's kind of working against them. Right, so again, I know I kind of keep circling, but I think then it's important to look at why are people still doing this, right? In this context where it's so difficult. And I think there's really something to be said for, reclaiming foodways, reclaiming a sense of home. People that, have an identity in agriculture and are going to keep doing it no matter what the challenges are. They're going to keep doing it everywhere. And to them, it's not just working in the field for someone else. It's having control over what they grow, over their own practices, their own labor every day. And so that's what I kind of find really fascinating about what's going on in this transition. What I am finding, right, is it really is happening all over the country. So wherever I go, when I speak to people, they say, oh, I really want you to come look at this case study in Washington, in Texas, and New Mexico, and Michigan. I'm not going to be able to go to all those places, but I think it is, they are kind of this not seen population of not just farm workers, but farmers. It's really fascinating almost every time I call a federal office or a state agency, and I say, oh, I'd like to talk to whoever there, or I'd like to meet with whoever there that might possibly work with Latino farmers. And everybody, almost every single time, someone corrects me and says, oh, the farm workers? And I say, no, the farmers, right? Again, these are some counties that have 80% of their fruit and vegetable farmers are Latino. And again, they can't even hear me say it on the phone. So I think it's really, an exceptional case in terms of resistance. So, like I've been saying, the transition from worker to owner in the U.S. currently requires facing, it's not, to me, and this goes back to kind of literature on the agrarian question, if you're interested in that literature, really has historically been about class transition and has really ignored, I think, migration and race. So I'm interested in kind of a shift in that literature and discussion in terms of, academic discussions. But also, I think, in terms of the movement discussions, right, and who's recognized as part of a food movement and who's not, right? And again, looking at kind of how they reclaim identity, their identity in their labor as a resistance to this mode of corporate agricultural development. And then I had to tag on yesterday that the strawberry farmers, again, are kind of this interesting exception. So I'll end it there because I think, there's a lot of really good stuff to talk about. Thank you.